Power in the medieval world often showed itself quietly through control of movement, food, and time rather than open bloodshed. This story begins not with clashing armies, but with restraint, calculation, and a road that suddenly narrowed. In late August of 1346, as mounted retinues moved between estates in the borderlands of Artois, travel carried risks that parchment records rarely spell out, yet everyone understood. Roads crossed disputed ground, loyalties shifted village by village, and armed men drifted between service and banditry, depending on who paid and who watched. The women did not ride under banners. No trumpets announced them. Their party followed a route used for generations, linking small lordships between Arras and the Somme. Escorts were present, though thin, drawn from household men rather than soldiers hardened by campaign. Such arrangements were common. Noblewomen traveled often, overseeing estates, attending marriages, visiting kin, or returning home after seasonal obligations. Protection relied less on force than on shared assumptions about rank. Those assumptions failed when the road tightened, near a wooded rise, and the mounted figures appeared ahead, already positioned. No arrows flew, no charge followed. The escort read the situation quickly and stopped. Resistance promised injuries, not escape. Servants scattered toward the trees, knowing pursuit would be selective. Horses were taken first. Weapons followed. Voices stayed low. A short exchange settled matters. By nightfall, the women understood their position. Death had never been the intention. Their value lay elsewhere. Medieval warfare did not resemble the clean divisions suggested by chronicles of great battles. Most violence happened between those moments, in raids, seizures, and brief encounters driven by opportunity. Capturing high-status travelers fit within that world. Such acts blurred the line between war and private enterprise, yet rarely shocked contemporaries when carried out with restraint. Rank mattered immediately. Names were asked for. Lineage was noted. One captor recognized a seal hanging from a belt pouch and nodded, already calculating. From that moment, the women were no longer simply prisoners. They became future conversations, sums to be named, messages to be sent. They were moved inland before dawn, away from open roads and curious villages. The holding site showed no signs of haste or cruelty. Doors locked, guards posted, instructions given quietly. Confinement followed patterns familiar across northern France during periods of conflict. Safe custody mattered more than comfort. Excess kindness risked weakness. Excess severity damaged value. Food was limited, though not absent. Bread arrived once a day. Water came from a nearby well. No explanation accompanied the routine. Such silence formed part of captivity. Uncertainty unsettled more effectively than threats. Without news, captives could not judge whether negotiations had begun or stalled, whether their absence had been noticed, or whether delay served their captors' interests. Medieval society treated noble bodies as repositories of obligation. A woman of rank carried family alliances, dowries, inheritance rights, and future marriages within her person. To harm her meant consequences beyond immediate reprisal. To preserve her meant leverage. Captors knew this. Captives knew it as well. The absence of violence did not lessen fear. Days stretched. Hunger crept in slowly, dulling thought rather than provoking panic. Talk among the women stayed practical. Who might be contacted first? Which household could raise coin quickly? Which kin held influence with neighboring lords? Calculation replaced outrage. This quiet phase of captivity often escapes attention because it lacked spectacle. Yet, such moments defined medieval power more clearly than battlefields. Control over people, space, and pace determined outcomes long before formal negotiations began. By the time letters were drafted and messengers sent, positions had already hardened. The captors waited with equal patience. No demands were voiced yet, no terms announced. Delay applied pressure without risking injury. Records from similar seizures show that days or weeks could pass before formal contact occurred, allowing captors to assess risk, confirm identity, and prepare their standing among peers. The women were held intact, watched, and measured. Their treatment signaled intent without committing to mercy. In this system, survival depended less on strength than on usefulness, and usefulness required time. But restraint alone could not carry negotiations forward, and silence eventually needed a signal that both sides would understand. Hunger in captivity was rarely accidental. It followed a logic that medieval people understood well, even if they rarely explained it in writing. Food marked status. Its absence signaled uncertainty. Between those two states lay pressure. The women learned the rhythm quickly. Bread appeared once a day, sometimes coarse, sometimes stale. Water was brought in measured amounts. No one starved outright, but no one felt steady either. Strength faded at the edges first. Sleep came unevenly. Time stretched and lost its shape. This was not neglect. It was management. In medieval households, provisioning was a visible sign of authority. Lords proved their power by feeding others, retainers, servants, guests. To withhold food was not merely to punish, but to suspend recognition. A captive who ate poorly occupied an uncertain category, neither guest nor servant nor fully acknowledged prisoner. For noble captives, this ambiguity mattered. They were not beaten, their clothes were not taken, their bodies were protected from obvious harm, yet their days lacked comfort. This balance kept them valuable without making them confident. It reminded them that their safety rested entirely on decisions made elsewhere. Such treatment aligned with custom. Surviving records from northern France and England show that captives awaiting ransom were often maintained at minimal cost until negotiations clarified their worth. Excess generosity before terms were set risked appearing weak. Excess cruelty risked retaliation. Hunger sat safely between. The women spoke quietly among themselves. Conversation returned again and again to food, not because of gluttony, but because food defined progress. A better meal would mean talks had begun. A sudden improvement would signal recognition. Until then, bread remained bread. Days passed without word. No messenger arrived. No lord announced himself. The absence itself applied pressure. Families left in ignorance worried. Captives imagined delay as abandonment. This uncertainty weighed more heavily than physical discomfort. In medieval thought, patience carried moral weight. Yet it was rarely voluntary. Captivity stripped people of choice. Hunger sharpened awareness of dependence. Each mouthful became a reminder of who controlled the future. The guards remained distant. They followed instructions precisely and spoke little. They did not insult the women or threaten them. This restraint was deliberate. Cruelty risked complaint later, once letters and witnesses entered the picture. A reputation for mistreatment could reduce ransom or provoke retribution. Hunger also served a practical function. Weakened captives were less likely to resist or attempt escape. They conserved energy. Movement slowed. The environment itself discouraged risk. Medieval detention relied less on iron and more on calculation. Outside the chamber, preparations likely advanced quietly. Names were confirmed, messengers selected, sums estimated based on lineage, marriage prospects, and the political moment. Such work required time. Hunger bought that time. The women understood that their captors were not improvising. Everything followed pattern. They had heard similar stories before, spoken cautiously in halls and solar rooms. Others had endured the same waiting, the same thinning meals, the same silence before contact was made. At night, the hunger felt heavier. Sleep came shallow. Bodies ached. Thoughts turned inward. Yet even then, the logic held. They were alive because they mattered. Their captors had chosen restraint. That choice implied intention. Eventually, the pattern broke. One morning, bread arrived fresher than before. Water came in a clean vessel rather than a chipped jug. The change was subtle, almost dismissible, yet unmistakable to those who had been waiting. Someone had made a decision. Such shifts often preceded formal acknowledgement. Before words were exchanged, conditions improved. Recognition came first through provisioning. The body received the message before the mind. The women did not celebrate. Experience warned against it. A better meal could signal progress, but it could also serve as reassurance, keeping captives calm while negotiations stalled elsewhere. Nothing was certain yet. Still, hunger eased slightly. Enough to notice. Enough to suggest that silence would not last much longer. Yet food alone could not conclude matters, and acknowledgement required something more deliberate, more visible, and harder to misread. Medieval captivity made sense only when understood as an economic system. People were not seized at random, and noblewomen least of all. Their bodies carried value because society had agreed that rank created obligation, and obligation could be converted into payment. Ransom was not an improvised act of desperation. By the 14th century, it followed recognizable patterns across northern France. Amounts varied widely, but the logic stayed consistent. Lineage mattered more than age. Marriage prospects mattered more than temperament. A woman tied to multiple estates or alliances could command a higher sum than a closer male relative with fewer connections. Captors calculated carefully. They considered who would pay, how quickly funds could be raised, and what political costs might follow. A ransom set too high could delay payment and invite intervention. One set too low suggested weakness and diminished standing among peers. Reputation mattered. A lord known for fair handling of captives found negotiations smoother in the future. Women occupied a specific place in this system. Their value rarely lay in battlefield skill or command, but in continuity. Through marriage, inheritance, and guardianship, noblewomen linked properties and families. Harm done to them echoed outward. Protection, therefore, was not kindness, but prudence. Records from the period show that women were often kept under closer household supervision than men. They might be lodged within a lord's residence rather than a tower or outbuilding. This arrangement protected them while signaling seriousness. It also allowed captors to present themselves as orderly and controlled, not reckless. Letters formed the backbone of negotiation. Messengers carried carefully worded notices that avoided threats and emphasized mutual interest. The language remained formal. Captors stated that the women were safe, alive, and properly held. They avoided unnecessary detail. Silence served as leverage until contact was made. Families receiving such letters understood the subtext immediately. Safety implied obligation. Delay implied cost. The longer negotiations took, the more expense accrued on both sides. Time itself became part of the price. Captors often advanced small improvements in treatment once contact began. Better food, warmer rooms, limited movement. These gestures reassured families and preserved value. They also demonstrated control. Everything given could be withdrawn if talks faltered. The women likely sensed these shifts before hearing any news. Changes in routine signaled movement elsewhere. A servant lingered longer. A guard spoke more freely. These small signs mattered. Ransom negotiations rarely followed straight lines. Disputes arose over amount, timing, and guarantees. Families bargained, citing previous agreements or hardships. Captors countered with reminders of cost and responsibility. Third parties sometimes intervened, especially when disputes threatened local stability. Throughout this process, the women remained present yet absent from decisions. Their role was to endure visibly and intact. Any sign of illness or mistreatment weakened their captor's position. Any sign of defiance risked prolonging captivity. This arrangement placed moral weight on restraint. Lords prided themselves on managing power without excess. Proper handling of captives demonstrated maturity and authority. Brutality signaled desperation or poor governance. Economic thinking shaped every step. Food was weighed against cost, guards against risk, delay against potential profit. Medieval power did not rush when patience promised advantage. The women's continued survival confirmed that negotiations had entered a serious phase. They were no longer anonymous holdings. They were named, valued, and accounted for. Their presence shaped correspondence, moving beyond the walls that held them. Yet negotiation alone could not stabilize the situation. Letters lacked immediacy. Coin had not yet changed hands. Something visible was needed to mark intention and settle expectations. Still, calculation required a gesture that words could not fully provide, one that would speak clearly to both captives and those waiting beyond the walls. When the Lord finally appeared, it was not to announce terms or demand obedience. He arrived to be seen, and then he gave orders that mattered more than words. The hall was prepared in daylight. Tables were brought out and wiped clean. Bread was fetched from the household stores, not the rough loaves issued to servants, but the pale kind reserved for those of standing. Meat was carved properly, with care taken over portions. Wine was poured into cups that matched, not whatever vessels lay closest at hand. The guards were told where to stand and, more importantly, where not to. Nothing about the scene suggested haste. This was deliberate. In medieval society, the table carried meaning beyond nourishment. To eat under a lord's roof placed a person within his order, even if only temporarily. Meals defined relationships: master and retainer, host and guest, protector and dependent. To feed someone well was to acknowledge their place in the hierarchy, even while asserting control over it. The women were brought in without ceremony. No speeches were made, no apology offered. The food was already there when they arrived, arranged as if the hall had been waiting for them rather than the other way around. They hesitated. That pause mattered. Hunger alone could have driven them forward, yet they stopped because they understood the weight of the gesture. In captivity, sudden generosity often carried conditions. A well-set table could mean release soon, or it could mean expectation. Either way, it marked a shift. The Lord did not sit with them. He stood nearby long enough to be seen, then withdrew. His absence reinforced the message. This was not fellowship. It was recognition without equality. Such acts fit neatly within medieval custom. Lords demonstrated authority through visible order. A controlled household reflected a controlled domain. Feeding captives properly showed that the situation was stable, managed, and worth respecting. It signaled to any witnesses that negotiations had entered a formal stage. Food also reassured those beyond the walls. Servants talked, guards repeated what they had seen. News traveled outward that the women were being kept well. This mattered. Families negotiating ransom listened closely for such signs. A lord who fed captives generously presented himself as reliable, someone who would honor terms once agreed. The women ate slowly. They watched each other, aware that every movement was being observed. The meat tasted almost unreal after days of thin fare. Bread filled the mouth rather than scratching it. Wine warmed the body. Strength returned in small increments. Yet no one relaxed fully. They understood that the meal did not end captivity. It reshaped it. The table drew a line between neglect and intention. Before they had been held, now they were being kept. That distinction mattered deeply in medieval logic. Keeping implied responsibility. Responsibility implied outcome. This was not kindness. It was governance. The Lord's decision also protected his own position. By feeding the women well, he reduced the risk of illness. He ensured they would appear healthy when presented to envoys or released. He avoided accusations of mistreatment that could complicate talks or damage his standing. Every detail communicated stability. The guards did not touch the food. No one hurried the women. The hall remained quiet. Order itself became the message. For the captives, disbelief gave way to understanding. They were no longer invisible. Their presence had been formally acknowledged. Someone had calculated that the moment required clarity rather than pressure. Such gestures often preceded written terms. Before coin changed hands, before oaths were exchanged, the table established expectations. It told all involved that the matter would be resolved through recognized channels. The women left the hall fuller, steadier, and more aware of their place in the process. Their hunger eased, but their dependence remained. They had been seen, and that visibility carried both comfort and constraint. Still, a meal could not conclude negotiations, and recognition did not end waiting. It only gave waiting a different shape. The days that followed did not feel like the days that came before. The walls were the same, the doors still closed at night, guards remained at their posts, yet the meaning of captivity had shifted. Food now arrived regularly and in proper measure. Bread stayed fresh, broth carried substance. Occasionally, meat appeared again, not in abundance, but enough to sustain strength. The change was not meant to comfort, it was meant to preserve. Once recognition had been granted, neglect no longer served a purpose. The women were now part of an active process, not a suspended one. Their condition mattered, their appearance mattered. Their health became an accounting concern. Waiting took on a different character. It was no longer empty. Each day suggested movement elsewhere. Messengers came and went beyond the chamber walls. Names were spoken more freely. Servants addressed the women with slightly more care. Small signals accumulated. Negotiations rarely advanced in a straight line. Sums proposed in letters were challenged. Timelines were debated. Guarantees were requested. The women were not present for these exchanges, but their bodies bore the consequences of every decision made at a distance. They understood that restraint was now expected of them. Any sign of illness or distress would complicate matters. Any display of resistance could be interpreted as ingratitude or risk. Survival required cooperation, not obedience, but awareness. Medieval captivity demanded patience above all else. Time itself acted as pressure on both sides. Families sought to resolve matters before alliances shifted or resources thinned. Captors weighed delay against the cost of continued maintenance. The women existed at the center of this balance, present yet powerless. The meal had not promised freedom, it had promised order. Such order reflected how medieval power preferred to operate. Lords measured themselves not only by what they could take, but by what they could hold without disorder. Managing captives well demonstrated competence. It signaled that outcomes would be predictable, not impulsive. For the women, this predictability offered a narrow form of security. They could plan their days. They could conserve strength. They could prepare for eventual movement, whether release or transfer. The uncertainty narrowed. Records from similar cases show that captivity could stretch for months. Some women were returned quickly. Others waited longer as families struggled to gather funds or negotiate terms. Throughout, survival depended less on courage than on endurance. This endurance carried its own discipline. The women observed routines carefully. They measured tone, gesture, and timing. They learned when to speak and when silence served them better. Such awareness often proved more useful than defiance. The Lord's household, too, adjusted. Guards treated the women less as burdens and more as responsibilities. Servants recognized that their care reflected on their master. Order extended outward. Eventually, release would come. Coin would be counted. Oaths would be sworn. Doors would open. When that moment arrived, the women would be returned not as victims rescued from cruelty, but as assets concluded properly. This distinction mattered deeply in medieval society. Being released intact preserved reputation. Families resumed alliances without shame. Lords demonstrated that power could be exercised without excess. The system reaffirmed itself. The story does not end with triumph or gratitude. It ends with understanding. In the medieval world, survival often depended on being useful, legible, and patient within structures that valued order over mercy. Hunger taught dependence. The table taught recognition. Waiting taught endurance. The lesson remains plain. Power does not always announce itself through violence. Often it works through control of timing, resources, and acknowledgement. Those who survive learn to read these signals and adapt without illusion. If this story holds meaning, it lies in recognizing how quiet decisions shape outcomes more reliably than dramatic acts. Pay attention to what is given, what is withheld, and when the balance shifts. That is where history usually turns.